There is a way to escape the race of mouse without dropping everything and going to live in the woods, and he was discovered by a man for over 150 years. Today, millions of people are stuck in debt, appointments, and a clock that never stops, running to get nowhere. Do you feel that you are always busy but rarely alive? Henry David Thoreau has proven that there is another way, simple, deep, and liberating. And in this video you will find out exactly how he did and how to apply it to your life now. Just check it out if you already clicked the subscribe button. Have you noticed how American cities never sleep? Even at dawn, there is a constant snoring, the air conditioning zumbing, trucks passing the freeway, ads flashing on the glass facades. It is as if the country itself breathed haste. But there was a man who dared to hold this breath. His name was Henry David Thoreau. Imagine Boston in the mid-19th century. The factories start to spit smoke to the sky. The streets are filled with workers running so as not to lose the time. The telegraph shortens distances, but stretches anxiety. And in the midst of this gear, a 28-year-old observes, not with admiration, but with strangeness. Where are everyone running? He thinks. No one responds. Thoreau sees something that others do not see. The mouse race has begun, even before it was named after. Men exchange years of life for salaries that barely support what they buy to display. Women learn to measure value for the appearance of the house. Children grow up in a hurry to become adults, and adults live as if they are late for a meeting that never arrives. One morning he takes a map, not a political map, but a map of trails, lakes, and woods. The line that attracts you the most is a blue scribble called Walden Pond. He doesn't know if he's running or coming home, and maybe doesn't matter. What matters is that he decides. Here, pause and think. If you were going to drop everything today, what would you leave behind? Your car, your cell phone, your agenda, or something deeper, perhaps an identity that has been shaped to fit the mold of society. Thoreau leaves everything. Buy an axe. It builds with its own hands a wooden cabin, so small that it would not fit a modern sofa. Does not take a watch. It does not take radio. It only takes paper, pencil, and willingness to hear what silence has to say. And the day the city loses silence, he finds him. Between the reflection of the water and the whisper of the trees, Thoreau realizes something that would change your life. And if you hear until the end of this story, it can change yours as well. But beware. What he discovered is not comfortable. At first, Walden was just silence and manual work. With each blow of the axe, Thoreau felt that something inside was left, but not in pain. It was as if the urgent layers imposed by the city were detached from his skin. The wood gives in to the blade, and along with it gave the illusion that it needed to run somewhere. Have you ever felt that? The strange peace of not competing with anyone? In the United States, this feeling is almost prohibited. Here, freedom is often sold as a choice of consumption. The car you want, the house you want, the brand you want. But Thoreau began to be suspicious of something few dared to say. The freedom that one buys is not freedom, is funding, and all financing has an owner. In the city, her time was mortgaged to pay rent, food, clothes she didn't even need. In Walden, his cost of living was so low that, for the first time, he had what every man says he wants, but few can: time. And time, he realized, was the true currency of existence. In the early days, Thoreau got up with the sun and slept with the darkening. Without watch, he learned to measure the hours from the angle of light in the water. There was no agenda, just essential tasks: spoon, cut wood, cook, write. And yet, a paradox chased him. By fleeing society, he began to see society more clearly. He wrote down everything: the birds that sang at the same time every day, the subtle changes of color on the leaves, the silence broken by a fish jumping. Every detail seemed a living metaphor for the human condition. The lake, for example, always calm on the surface, but full of invisible life in the depths. How many of us live this with quiet faces and turbulent thoughts? And then came the question he couldn't silence. If true freedom costs so little, why do everyone pay so expensive for the fake? Perhaps because cheap freedom requires courage, and courage is not for sale. The winter approached, and along with him the first great proof: survive without depending on the city. And this is where the story is no longer just about Thoreau, and it starts to be about you. The cold came like a silent enemy. In the fall, Walden was gold and alive, but now the lake was beginning to cover himself with a thin film of G-Link. The mornings brought a denser, almost solid silence. Even the sound of the birds seemed to freeze in the air. It was the type of winter that does not forgive mistakes. Thoreau had no supermarket a few minutes, no central warming, nor neighbors to lend salt. It all depended on what he had prepared, and the ability to improvise. Can you imagine? In the US, where each problem usually has a 24-hour service to solve, he was alone with cold, hunger, and his own thoughts. The days began to organize in a ritual: cut wood, take care of the fire, seek water breaking the layer of ice, cooking what had stored. And in this cycle, an uncomfortable revelation came about. Most of what we call modern life is not living. It's just keeping the machine working. Without commitment, no traffic, no slips coming in the mail, Thoreau found that surviving is not as complicated as they made us believe. It is difficult to feel alive, but loneliness does not forgive. It is not just the absence of people, it is the presence of yourself, without distractions. And when the lake fell silent and the wind began to speak in the cracks of the cabin, Thoreau heard things that never had the courage to face. Old fears, regrets he thought was buried, questions about the meaning of existence. Have you spent so much time with yourself that it started to be surprised? With each cold night, he realized that winter was not just climate, it was internal, a slow freezing of the certainties you had about the world. And that's where he understood. The rated race doesn't just happen on the streets of Boston or on New York avenues, it also happens within each one. When we run away from facing each other, winter only forces the confrontation. In that cold silence, Thoreau began writing more than ever. Not just observations about nature, but secret maps of the human soul. Maps that curiously seem to point to the same place. Freedom begins when we stop running. But before he could fully understand, an unexpected visit knocked on his door and brought with him a dilemma that would change everything. It was dawn when the sound came. 3 dry, spaced, firm beats. In the middle of winter, each noise is amplified, but that was not the crack of a tree or the howl of the wind. It was human. Thoreau got up slowly, feeling the cold biting his bare feet. The fire was almost erased, throwing long shadows through the walls of the cabin. When he opened the door, he found a man. Tall, thin, his face marked by the wind and his eyes loaded with urgent. I didn't say the name. It just asked for heat. In the United States of the 19th century, strangers knocking on his door in the middle of the night were not common, even less in the middle of a frozen forest. The man approached the fire and was silent for long minutes, as if the words needed to defrost before leaving. "Do you live alone here?" he asked finally. "Yes," replied Thoreau. The stranger let out a short, almost incredulous laugh. "Then you managed to escape." This phrase was in the air like an echo. Escape what? From the city? Of the economy? Of the species itself? The visitor began to tell his story. He had worked a lifetime at a Lowell fabric factory. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. A salary that barely bought bread and coal, and a boss who said that was the price of progress. Until, one day, he decided to walk. And he walked until he didn't know where he was going anymore, until the trail brought him to Walden. Thoreau noticed something curious. The man did not ask for money, food, or permanent shelter. "I just asked for a little heat to travel." And then, a dilemma was born. If it offered total hospitality, perhaps the visitor never left, bringing society back into his cabin. If it refused, it would be denying exactly what simple life should cultivate: compassion. In the following silence, Thoreau remembered something he had written days before. True freedom is not isolating from the world, but choosing how and when to open the door for it. And so, decided. He prepared a hot meal, offered a corner for the man to rest, but warned that at dawn, each would go his own way. The visitor accepted, and the next morning, he left only one scribbled message on a piece of wood. "The cold of the woods is more honest than the heat of the city." Thoreau stared at that phrase, feeling that he was no longer alone. But he barely knew that this meeting was only the prelude to something greater. Society would not leave him alone. The next days were quiet, but not for long. In the 3rd week after the visit of the unknown man, Thoreau heard another sound from the trail. This time, multiple steps, muffled voices, and then again, knocking on the door. When he opened, he found 2 men dressed in heavy coats and aligned hats. They were not lost travelers. They were city officials. "Mr. Thoreau?" asked the eldest with an almost military formality tone. "Yes. We have pending matters. Taxes not paid." This is how the city extended its invisible hand to the heart of the woods. Thoreau knew that moment would arrive. He knew that for the government, simple life was not exemption from obligations. It was suspicious. He refused to pay, not for lack of money, but at first. "I don't finish a system that holds men for not following their unfair laws," he said firmly. And that's how, in a few hours, he left the cabin to be taken to the chain of Concord. The contrast was brutal, from Walden's silence to the smell of iron, mold, and piled voices. But curiously, Thoreau didn't feel he was losing his freedom. On the contrary, it was proving that it does not depend on physical space, but in inner decision. In prison, he spent the night reflecting. How many people outside lived free only in the geographical sense, but were arrested for debts, for jobs they hated, for commitments that could not break? And how many accepted this prison because they never dared to test it? The next morning, someone paid his taxes against his will, and he was released. Upon returning to Walden, he realized something strange. The cabin looked smaller, as if the simple act of being taken by the law had made the woods shrink. And he understood. No matter how far you go, society will always try to reach you. The real question is, when she arrives, will you open the door or keep it closed? But the story still kept a turn. As he returned to simple life, an unexpected event began to draw in cities, something that would force him to review his own definition of freedom. It was the summer of 1846 when the news crossed the woods and reached Thoreau. The United States were at war with Mexico. For most, this was just another headline in Boston newspapers or an inflamed speech in the squares. For him, it was a brutal reminder that the civilized world not only runs, it also kills as it runs. Sitting by the lake, Thoreau thought of the absurdity of that. Men who had never seen the Mexican desert were sent to fight and die in the name of borders scratched on maps they had never touched. And all this funded by the same taxes he had refused to pay. It wasn't just a political issue. Was it a moral dilemma? Participating in the game or living on its fringes? Have you ever felt that the world demands that you choose one side, even when all sides look wrong? That was the weight that Thoreau carried. What's more, he realized that the rated race was not limited to money and consumption. It also included the hurry to obey, to align, in fighting battles that are not yours. The letters he received from friends in the city spoke of patriotism, honor, and the duty of every free man. But deep down he saw something else. A deep fear of being different, of refusing the current. The true war, he thought, was not in Mexico. He was within each citizen in the battlefield between consciousness and convenience. It was at this time that he began writing more intensely about civil disobedience, not as blind rebellion, but as an act of conscience. For Thoreau, individual morals should be above laws, and simple life was a silent but radical form of resistance. But as he tuned his ideas, something began to change in Walden. The forest, which once seemed untouched, now received more visitors. Curious journalists, young idealists, even politicians came to hear the man who dared to say no. And with this attention, there was a subtle danger, the possibility of turning simplicity into a show. He needed to decide, continue to Walden or abandon the cabin before she turned tourist attraction. And the decision, when it came, was not what everyone expected. Can I advance? The cabin that was once refuge began to fill with noise that did not belong to the forest. First were curious steps on the trail, then low conversations, and finally enthusiastic voices calling his name as if Thoreau were a fair attraction. Boston young people came to see the free man, take notes, ask what was the secret to living outside the rated race. Some came genuinely in search of answers, others just to be able to tell friends that they had seen the eccentric of the lake. Thoreau realized with a growing discomfort that he was turning what he feared most, part of the show that society consumes, and then follow his life as if nothing had changed. He heard phrases like, "Amazing what you did, but it's not for me." Or, "I wanted to live like that, but my work doesn't allow it." It was as if everyone admired the jump, but no one wanted to get wet. Have you noticed how people can idolize an idea without ever practicing it? Simplicity, for many, it was a beautiful photograph, not a real path. And Thoreau began to feel that by staying in Walden, he could be feeding another illusion, that just visiting freedom to understand it. The lake was still the same, but the human presence altered silence. The previously lonely margins now kept footprints. Even the corner of the birds seemed farther away, as if they also retreated in the face of human curiosity. Thoreau wondered, if the escape becomes a tourist spot, is it still escape? It was in one of these afternoons while a group dispersed by the trail which he decided, it would not warn anyone. I wouldn't make speeches. I would just leave Walden. Simple life was not in the cabin. It was in the gesture of, whenever necessary, starting again. And so, on a cold morning, he closed the wooden door, supported the axe on his shoulder, and left the trail without looking back. The woods swallowed his steps, and the lake, like an old accomplice, kept the secret. But the story of Thoreau didn't end there. Upon returning to town, he discovered that true freedom was not only in the departure, but in the way of living within the world, without becoming his prisoner. And this return would bring harder lessons than any winter. Can I advance? The first impact was sound. After years of Walden, the city looked like a machine that never turned off. Windings, hammers beating, hasty voices, bells playing, street trading sessions from fresh bread to land for sale. It was like entering a busy sea after living in a calm lake. Thoreau walked the streets of Concord and noticed a detail that he did not see before. Almost everyone looked to the floor as they walked, as if they feared finding something that stopped them. The noise was not just physical, it was mental. Conversations were about business, debts, political news. No one talked about sunrise, changing stations, or silence. You have already returned to a place and realized that it has not changed, but you do? It was that. The city was still the same, but now Thoreau saw clearly what was just the backdrop before, the constant rhythm of people running, not because they wanted to get somewhere, but because they were afraid to stop. Some acquaintances received him enthusiastically, others with irony. "So the adventure is over?" he responded with a half-smile. I didn't want to explain that the true adventure had not been to live in the woods, but to learn to carry the woods inside itself. The great lesson was clear. It is not enough to escape the rated race. One must learn to walk in the middle of it without running, and that required a different kind of courage. In Walden, freedom came from the absence of temptations and obligations. In the city, she would have to resist amid the constant offer of easy shortcuts to sell, distract, or silence. Thoreau resumed his writings and began talking at local meetings, not to promote himself but to plant doubts. Short, direct, sometimes uncomfortable phrases. Do you work to live or live to work? What is more expensive, a house or the time you sell to pay it? Some heard and got annoyed. Others were silent, and it was in these silences that he saw something germinate. But it was not long before their ideas bothered powerful people. And soon the man who had resisted Walden's winter would have to resist a much more dangerous winter, that of social isolation imposed by those who fear the freedom of others. Can I advance? This time the cold did not come from the wind. It was a cold made of sharp glances, invitations that stopped coming, doors that closed even before he could hit. Thoreau realized that in the city, punishment for challenging the system is not always physical prison. It is invisible exile. Some neighbors began to avoid it on the streets. Traders changed the subject when he entered. It was not explicit hatred. It was discomfort. Have you noticed how the truth said aloud can freeze a faster than any winter? He kept writing, but now he felt the weight of loneliness in a place where people were everywhere. In Walden, loneliness was clean, almost sacred. In the city, she was contaminated by murmurs, judgments, and misunderstandings. The woods leave you alone. Society makes you feel alone. Even so, Thoreau persisted. He talked about how true independence is not in accumulating, but in needing little, about how blind obedience feeds wars, injustices, and silent miseries, and about how each of us, by accepting haste as a way of life, becomes complicit in the rated race. A few began to approach, attracted not by the figure of Thoreau, but by the idea that it was possible to live differently. And it's curious how it works. When you plant a seed of freedom in one's mind, it can be dormant for years, until a crisis germinates it. But before I could see any fruit of this planting, Thoreau was called to talk about a young man in Boston. Accepted. Not because he wanted to applause, but because he felt it was time to say something that could cost his reputation once and for all, or perhaps released some from eternal haste. And that night, in the face of dozens of attentive faces, he began a speech that no one forgot. But his last sentence was so unexpected that he shared the audience in half. Can I advance? The hall was lit by oil lamps. The smell of burnt wood mixed with the wet clothes. The rain fell outside tightly. The young people were sitting on narrow benches, some leaning forward, anxious. Thoreau climbed the small stage without haste, did not take notes, did not take written speech, only the silence that always accompanied him. It started talking low, almost like those who confess a secret. Most men live lives in silent despair. Some frowned. Others nodded slowly. He talked about Walden, about cutting wood with his own hands, about waking up with the sun and sleeping with the stars, but soon changed the tone. I didn't come here to convince them to live in the woods. I came to ask, what would you be willing to lose to be free? The question was suspended in the air. And then came the phrase that broke the room. If tomorrow the government, the church, and the market would disappear, would you still live? Half of the public reacted with discomfort, the other half with a dense silence. He didn't offer ready answers. He said that true freedom is not only political, not only economic, is spiritual, that the free man is one who can at any moment abandon the superfluous and remain whole. Ended by saying, what you call stability, I call comfortable arrest. And what you call risk, I call your life. Shy applause came. But there were also cold eyes. Some would never seek him again. Others, that same night, would go home and be awake until late, staring at the ceiling, thinking of each word. Thoreau left the hall and felt the wind from the street like a silent confirmation. The message had been launched. Now it was up to time to decide who would have the courage to follow her. But before winter ended, he would have one last proof. One that did not involve cold, taxes, or crowds, but mortality itself. Can I advance? The body began to warn before the mind accepts. First, a persistent cough, then a tiredness that did not match the vigor of who walked miles a day. Thoreau, now over 40, realized that the approaching winter would be the deepest of all, the one from which he does not turn. There was no drama in his posture. He kept writing, receiving few friends, observing the change of stations as he always had. But now, every leaf that fell seemed like a reminder. He said, death is not the end of simple life, it is the return to it. In the United States, the fever of progress was no longer only in factories. Iron rails cut the country, telegraphs joined distant states, and the rat's race gained speed with each new invention. Thoreau saw it all like a river that runs to a sea of oblivion, taking men and women without they realizing that they could swim to another margin. In recent months, his cabin was no longer the center of history. He was. The body was weakened, but the mind remained sharp. He wrote to the end about the need to live deliberately, to choose his own life before others choose for you. On a cold day of May 1862, surrounded by a few, he said goodbye without ceremony. He left no rich will, left no valuable properties. It has left words, and more importantly, an example, that it is possible to live outside the tax, which is possible to be free even when the whole world runs. And perhaps this is the most difficult inheritance to accept. True freedom does not fit in showcases, nor in speeches, nor in photographs. It only exists when you live it. If one day you feel that the noise of the city is unbearable, remember, you can always build your Walden wherever you are. Just close the door, hear the silence, and start over.